Hey everybody, Andrew Hogue here, your security, privacy, and forensics expert. Today I'm going to walk you through the steps to build a React Native Android app using GitHub Actions. This is a really great way to do things because GitHub Actions operate directly in the developer experience. So there's no need for them to jump out into other build systems or wait for other teams to make this happen for them. One of the other things I love about GitHub Actions is it's really an open marketplace with thousands of different actions written by many different companies and vendors, and the actions themselves are actually open source. So you can go in there, look at how they've built it, and then integrate different workflows from different vendors all in a single place. The other really cool thing is everything that you do is source controlled and part of your overall repo. So everything now to build the app and maintain the app is contained within the repository of code. I actually wrote this blog a couple of months ago, and since that time, the Joplin developers actually implemented this technique. And so the files that I were creating now have a name collision with what the official repo has. So I went ahead and updated this blog, but definitely take a look at their build Android action as well, so you can see how they chose to implement it. My implementation is going to be a really simple, straightforward one that people can then build on from there. So let's dive right in. As always, everything I'm going to talk about here today is also on my personal website. Don't panic. Just go to andrewhogue.com, click on blog, and then you can select this top one for building a React Native Android app with GitHub Actions. Like we've done in the past, the first thing we need to do is actually fork the Joplin app repo if you haven't done that. If not, just click this link, make sure you have a GitHub account or you create one and log in, and then you can fork that repo directly into your own account. That'll make a copy of all of their code and make it really simple to just operate on your own copy of the code, not the production code. So we'll just go ahead and create a directory on our home directory called SPF Expert, and then we'll change into that directory. You can see here I actually already have the Joplin app out there. I've also used the K9 app for other examples. So if you haven't cloned the repo, what you're going to want to do is come out here and do a git clone command. And I have another blog post that I can link you to that will give you step-by-step on how to do this. But we're just going to go ahead and clone the repo directly in here. Now again, I'm going to cancel that because I already have the repo out there. So once you do that, you're going to change into the Joplin directory. And now we can just take a look at all the files that are out there. The way GitHub Actions work is there's actually a .github hidden folder inside every repo. And then inside there's a workflows folder. You can actually edit files directly in that folder, or you can use something called starter workflows, which you could go to the GitHub website, use their web-based UI to then set up a GitHub action and never actually have to edit the file directly by hand or on your local computer. I'm going to go ahead and use the local computer version because that's just where I'm more comfortable, but you can use whatever is most effective for you. Now GitHub has fantastic documentation, and you can come out here and take a look at the workflow syntax. I put the links out there. So as you can see, there's really extensive documentation. So as you get into more complex workflows, you'll be able to read up on the docs and hopefully be able to implement exactly what you need. The key things that we'll focus on today is there'll be a name for the particular action. That'll end up showing up in the GitHub interface, so it's really important to name something logically there. We'll also talk about when we'll kick off a particular action. In this instance, we're going to use something called workflow dispatch. It's really my favorite way to test GitHub Actions before I turn them on and generate a bunch of actions that may be triggered by pull requests or commits to different branches. So workflow dispatch is just a way that says, give me a little drop down in the GitHub website where I can go in there, select the action, just manually run it whenever I want to. And then lastly, you'll specify the specific jobs. So these will be the steps that are involved in your workflow. So we're going to go ahead and now create the workflow file. Originally I had called it build-android.yaml, but I went ahead and tacked on the SPF expert part so we don't have a name collision with the existing workflow that the Joplin developers have added. And as I mentioned, that's going to reside in the .github folder under workflows. So here you can see the contents of the YAML file. I went ahead and put all of this out on the blog so you can go out there and simply copy it. YAML is really sensitive about the number of spaces and indentations that occur. So if you run into any issues, you want to double check that but I've tested this file a few times and hopefully there won't be any issues. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to go ahead and start out with the workflow dispatch event. So that is going to allow us just to manually trigger things. And I went ahead and said, just do this on the dev branch only. But of course, you could always use different branches and run different jobs for testing, integration, things of that sort. And there are many different types of events that you can use for triggers, and we'll go through that in a couple of minutes. So the next part of what we're going to do is focus on the job section. And inside the job sections, you just have different jobs that you can run. In this particular instance, you can see I'm starting off with a build job. That's going to run on the latest version of Ubuntu. So this is just going to be a runner, as they call it, basically a virtual machine that's going to run in the GitHub cloud. And then we're going to have different steps inside that workflow. So here you can see the first thing we want to do is check out a repository. And you're going to see the uses and then different namespaces here. So these are basically the different actions from the GitHub Marketplace. And GitHub itself has core actions built in that people use all the time. So those will always be prefaced with actions. And so this is the version 2 of the checkout action. Then we're going to go ahead and install Java. And again, there's a standard action that GitHub has built for this. So this will install Java and set it up properly on the Ubuntu runner. You can see that we have different variables that we can pass through with this. So I said use Java version 11 because that's what React Native needs right now. Use the adopt distribution and go ahead and cache Gradle because Gradle is going to be a core part of our build process. Now, one of the really important steps that I think some people miss is to go ahead and validate that Gradle installation. And the reason is that there's an attack where people will go out, especially to open source apps, and say, hey, your version of Gradle is outdated. I went ahead and updated that for you. Here's a pull request. I'm making it really simple for you to just update that. And then a lot of maintainers are like, great, I got a lot of things going on. I don't have time to do that. And they accept the merge. And in fact, it is Gradle, but it's Gradle with something else added. And so people could do different types of attacks against the software, the supply chain, or things of that sort. So there's a really cool action that's called validate Gradle, which will look at the version of Gradle that is bundled and then compare that with the official checksums and make sure that this is indeed an official build. If not, this step will fail and the action will fail, protecting you and your users. So definitely use the validate Gradle step to make sure there aren't any attacks leveraging your automated build tools. Because this is a React Native app, we're going to go ahead and set up Node. Again, there's a standard action for that, and we're now using Node 16 for Joplin. And then there's a number of steps that you have to take in order to build a React Native app. So React Native is going to use yarn instead of npm, so we're going to go ahead and run a few steps here. And we're passing it multiple commands at once. So we're going to say change into the app mobile directory. This particular application uses what's called a monorepo. So instead of having separate repos for your Android app, your iOS app, your desktop app, there's even terminal versions of Joplin. Everything is contained in a single repo, which means our build scripts have to be a little bit smarter about what directories to change into and how to actually kick off the build process for that specific application. So we change into the app mobile directory, and then we're going to go ahead and install CorePack. CorePack is, again, something that you need in order to properly run Yarn and build a React Native mobile app. Once we have CorePack globally installed, we're just going to go ahead and run the yarn install command. Now, 2 more steps left. We're going to build the actual application. Again, there's a couple of commands here in this particular step. So we're going to change even further into the Android directory inside app-mobile. And then, as you may have seen from some of my previous posts and videos, we'll just go ahead and run the Gradle W assemble debug command. This will build the debug version of the app, but of course you're not limited by that. You could use Gradle to build your production app or beta versions or all kinds of other tool chains that you can integrate in here and directly call from your GitHub action. And then the last step, it's optional, but I like to do this, is I'm going to go ahead and upload the application. And you really need to pause for a minute to make sure you kind of think through the terminology here. So what this means is you're going to upload this particular artifact to the build process, and I'm going to call it app. And then here's the path to the artifact that I want to upload. So you can see here, this would be the debug version built by the Gradle process. And then we're going to retain that out there for 3 days. Uploading the artifact can be really important if you have a multi-step build process. So for example, let's say the first step is to build the Android app, and then the second step is to take that app and upload it to another service like Now Secure, where I'm the co-founder, to do security and privacy testing. Well, you don't want to rebuild it on the second step, so you simply create an artifact, and that'll be accessible to future steps inside that current workflow. So it's a very efficient way to do things. Now that you have the GitHub Action YAML file built, you need to actually go ahead and check this file in. So I've already done this ahead of time, so you can see here that the file's already been checked in and there are no changes. But if you haven't done this, you would simply do a git add command, and then you would add that file so it's being tracked by Git. And then from there, you can just do a commit, and then you'd put in some message, initial workflow file. Of course, I can never spell. Okay. Now, if you've actually cloned the repo from source, you'll actually find that there are multiple GitHub Actions already inside the workflows folder that the Joplin app developers are using. While that's really great, we actually don't need that for our particular example. They don't exist in my current file system, but I'm going to just show that to you real quick so you can remove those, then make your final commit, and then push everything up. If you don't make that step, it's possible that your different workflows will kick off even though they weren't really ones that you intended to run. So you can see out here that there are the unneeded workflows, and one of the ways to just verify this is you would just go out and list off the .github workflows folder and see what's in there. You can see right now for my particular installation, it's just the SPF expert version. But from the actual main repo, you can see that they'll have a GitHub Actions main, close stale issues, and build Android YAML. So I just use the git rm or git remove command, and then make a commit, and then again, push all of those out to the repo so everything's sitting up in GitHub ready for you to kick things off. Okay, now we're ready to actually kick off the workflow. One of the things that I want to mention is that there are many different types of events that you can use to trigger workflows. So we're going to use the workflow dispatch, which is great for manual quick testing. But I have a link out there and you can see all the different events that GitHub allows you to trigger actions on. It's actually pretty impressive. So we'll take a quick look at this. And you can see here that there's a bunch of different events: branch protection rules, forking, labels, public pull requests, etc. So any of these can be used to create pretty amazing GitHub Actions that automate all the workflows you need to maintain your repository. But let's get to the point where we can actually kick the workflow off. So I have a link on my blog that's actually going to link to my repo, which is not what you want. So just take the ahog42 portion and swap that out for whatever your username is. Once you're in your repo, you can come in here and click on the Actions tab at the top, and you'll see a list of all the different actions that you have. You can see there's a build Android app. So that was what we ended up naming inside the YAML file, the very first configuration under name. And if you have multiple actions here, that's why it's really important to make sure you choose something that makes sense. And then you can actually click on that particular action and then come over here to the Run Workflow drop down and literally just go kick off a new job. Now that'll take a second and will actually auto refresh the UI. You can just forcibly reload the web page too if you don't want to wait because you're impatient like me. Now one of the things is, on my last run, this took about 17 minutes, and it's actually not going to take as long this time around. The reason is there's been no real changes to the code, and one of the cool things about using some of the standard actions from GitHub is that you'll get things like cache management automatically built in. So you can see here that the setup Java Linux Gradle was cached and about 5 hours ago when I last tested this. So now this particular action that's running isn't going to have to run all those steps. And instead of taking the full 17 minutes, it's probably going to take at least a few minutes less. You can always click on the particular workflow itself and see the steps. Again, we only have a single job in here, the build job, but on other ones you'll see multiple steps. And then you can click in here and actually see the particulars of a step. So we already have blown through the installing Java, Gradle, and setting up Node because those were already done earlier today and cached. And then you'll see that there's going to be a number of different steps that we need to follow here. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the one that I did just a few hours ago so you can see what it looks like after it's been run. So here's a successful build. There are a couple of warnings that you'll see that Node flagged, and so you could see that, which is really helpful as a developer. And as I mentioned, I created the app artifact. So instead of that artifact just being accessible to other steps in your workflow, you can actually access it directly from here and go download that file or delete it if you want to. You can also get all the way into the very specific build steps and come into, for example, a particular step and see exactly what was happening. So lots and lots of details here if you need them, or if it's part of your process that you would use for, let's say, for auditing or compliance to show exactly how something was built. So I've already mentioned that there are a couple of different ways to access the artifact, but of course, you know, I like to do things command line. So the last thing I'm going to show you is how would I access that artifact that was built in the previous step through the command line? And the answer is, of course, GitHub has great APIs, and so this is a pretty straightforward thing to do. The first thing that we need to do, though, is to create a personal access token. Now, in order to do personal access tokens, there's a new beta feature that's out that's actually pretty awesome from a security standpoint. So you come in and you go under your settings, and then you come down here to developer settings, and then you can come in and look at your personal access tokens. And in the past, the token would basically give you carte blanche access to almost everything, and you really could only set a few different flags on the scope that it had. But they've now released fine-grained tokens, which is exactly what you want from a security standpoint. So least access privilege, minimizing people's scope, whatever you want to call it. We don't want to create a token that gives way more access than is needed. We want to have something that's very focused. So here in fine-grained access tokens, you can say generate a new token, and you can go ahead and give it a name. So we'll call this Joplin build. And then you can set an expiration date. I'm going to go ahead and set a custom one because I intend to delete this, and I'll just go ahead and set it for tomorrow. Maybe I'll manually delete it. And then we could call this whatever we want. Token to access build artifacts. Okay. And then I'm not going to give it access to public repositories, or certainly not all repositories. I'm just going to go ahead and say select repositories. And nice little search here. You can come in and look at your different repos. So here's my Joplin repo. And then you have the ability to just give it very specific permissions. So I'm going to go ahead and go under repository permissions, under actions, and the only thing we need to download the artifact is a read-only. That's actually going to automatically select a metadata feature as well, a metadata property as well for read-only. And then I'm just going to go here and say generate token. Now this token will actually only show up once, so you need to go ahead and just copy this guy right now. And for anybody kind of thinking I would have left this out here, by the time I post this blog, it will have not only expired, but I'll have also deleted it. Now we'll pop back over to our terminal, and let's go ahead and export a GitHub token, and we'll go ahead and paste that guy in there. Now that's going to make my token available to my environment. And now it's really straightforward to just call the REST API using that GitHub token. So I'm going to basically use curl, pass in the accept header for what kind of data that we're accepting, which is JSON. And then pass through my bearer token, which is this variable that we just saved. And then lastly, I'm going to call the REST API, the repo, then my particular username. So again, you're going to need to swap out your username, the particular repository, actions, and artifacts. And I'm going to go ahead and pipe that through JQ. So that's a nice little utility for looking at JSON documents. And then I'll run it through less, so that it doesn't scroll by too fast. So you can see here that we have two different artifacts that have been saved. They're stored in an array, and it's an array of objects. And right here you can see, like, here's the ID and a bunch of other information, right? The size, the name, when it was run. And there's actually a handy little link here called the archive download URL. So you can come out here and see all the different values. But in order to leverage that, I'm going to go ahead and paste that guy right there just to make it easy. So now that we have the archive URL, we're just going to actually run curl again. And we'll paste this guy in here. And so here we're using curl to say, okay, follow any symbolic links, output the particular file to the file system as it's named by the endpoint. And again, we're going to go ahead and accept GitHub JSON. We're going to pass through the GitHub token. And then here you can see I've got the download link, which is directly to the artifact and the zip endpoint. Now the reason it's a zip endpoint is these artifacts could have lots and lots of files. So by default, GitHub is going to automatically put it into a zip archive. That makes it easy to download a single file, and then you can go into that particular file and expand it in whatever other system you need to use it in. So here you can see we've downloaded the 62 meg file, and let's just go ahead and take a look at our directory. So you can see here, here's a new file called zip. So that's what we told it to name it. And you could always rename it with curl if you want. You can just check that out real quick. It is in fact a zip file. And you could unzip it. Let's just list the files off instead of unzipping it. So here you can see there's actually the content length, which if memory serves, that's actually what the JSON said earlier. You can see when it was created and then the name of the file. So let's just, instead of listing it, let's just go ahead and unzip it. So now that we've inflated that, you can see that we have an app-debug.apk, and that's exactly the build artifact that we had when we were building the app and using Gradle. So there you have it. You can see how simple it is to create a workflow file, to define the steps that you want, to make the process repeatable, and then to do things like have access to the artifacts so you can use them for other processes. In my next session, I'll actually show you how to do this for an iOS app, which is pretty similar, but there are some differences because building iOS versus Android is a bit of a different process. I hope you found the content useful, and as always, thanks so much for watching. Until next time.